objection.
Well, you should have. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys and assembled company, welcome to the World Storytelling Cafe. And tonight or today, this afternoon, if you happen to be in Washington, D.C., this evening, if you happen to be Louis, who's just had a fantastic holiday, we have the amazing, the stupendous, the fantastical Sarah Lloyd Winder doing stories for children. Take it away, Sarah.
Woo, what an introduction. That's exciting. Okay, so I've already told Louis about the pigeon and the squirrel, so they might return and go bang, tap, 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 tap over my head. But more likely are the bells of Old South Mims, and they will ring loudly soon because they've been practicing this week and they want to do a good show for you tonight as background to my stories. So this little story set, although oh dear, starts in Stowmarket, leaps down to London. So when we hear the bells, we have to think we're within the sound of Bow Bells. Now, there is a story in my family that my grandmother was born within the sound of Bow Bells, which makes her a Cockney. A lady less like a Cockney you would never meet. Very well-spoken lady she was, but she insisted she was born in that area. They moved shortly afterwards. So those stories are linking to some work I'm doing about the East End of London. Anyway, we're going to start with Stowmarket, where I was last weekend. And this is a proper fairy story. Because there are fairies in it. Well, these are not called fairies, though. These are called feskies. And feskies are tricksters. They are naughty and wicked. They could be evil, but I think we call them naughty and wicked, really. So here we go. There was once a girl called Sarah. Oh, another one. Yes, it is an old name and traditional name. Well, Sarah, she lived in Stowmarket in Suffolk, in the east of England. And there they have a history of feskies, wicked creatures who come and trick you, who steal things away. But they're also very exciting, and throughout her childhood, Sarah had always wanted to see a feskie. So she had stayed out late at night in case she could ever see one. She had crept to places that people had seen them. She had gone to the houses of people who said they'd seen them. But she never saw them. And as she grew up, she started to get a bit suspicious. And one day, when she was about 12, I think, she turned round to her friend and said, "I don't believe in feskies. It's made up." And she stomped off. And her friend was very afraid, you see, because you shouldn't say you don't believe in things like that, because it's bound to go bad at some point. Well, Sarah grew up and she got married and she had her own baby, a little baby boy, and he was great. But then when she had a second baby, he was very ill. Very, very ill, very tiny, and didn't last very long. So when she had her third child, a little girl, she was very panicked. The feskies will come and take my baby, she thought. I have to keep a watch. So during the day, she put the baby wrapped up around her and carried the baby everywhere she went. That's all right going to the shops. It's a bit more difficult doing the washing up with a baby. But she kept that baby next to her. And then in the night, she would wrap up the baby in beautiful blankets and lay it in the bed between her and her husband. But she was always waiting for those Feskies, always waiting, listening. One night in the autumn, when it was dark, she woke up in the middle of the night with a shock. She didn't know why. And then she looked in the middle of the bed, and was the baby there? No, the baby had gone. And she panicked. At first, she thought the baby might have wiggled down in the bed. So she lifted up the blankets. No baby. She lifted up her husband. No baby, hadn't laid on it. So she crept out of the bed. And she crept round the room. She did. She crept everywhere. She crept and she crept and she crept. And then she went to the window and she opened the curtains a little bit. And the bells came at the same time as she opened the curtains. And there on the other side of the room, she could just see her little baby lying on the floor with its arms and legs waving, and it was giggling because around it were a bunch of Feskies, and the Feskies were tickling the little baby, and the baby was laughing and chortling. But was she happy? Was Sarah happy that her baby was playing with the Feskies? No, she wasn't. She was absolutely panicked. But then when she dropped the curtain, she couldn't see anything. And she dashed across the room to get the baby, and she fell over the bed. She tripped backwards. There was noise and jolting. And then her hand reached and she touched warm little baby. And she pulled that warm little baby right to her. And then her husband woke up because there was such noise and her falling over and everything. And he pulled the curtains and said, "What's going on?" And then looked at the baby. The baby had no nappy left, because in those days they pinned the nappy on with pins. And there on the floor was a line of pins laid head to toe and head to toe and head to toe and head to toe. And as the mother and the father looked, they could hear giggling. Lots of giggling. And it seemed like shadows were dancing round the corner of the room and disappearing through the walls and down through the cracks in the floor. And the giggling continued, laughter and giggling of Feskies. As Sarah gripped that baby to her. And from that day forward, she made sure her baby was pinned into the bed. Can you imagine? Every night the baby was put in bed, it was pinned in because, as her husband said, Feskies don't like metal. So they had to take those pins out very carefully in order to try and steal it. But because Sarah pinned her baby into first their bed and then its own little bed, she told her family that she had saved her baby. And for the rest of her life, Sarah told the story of the night the Feskies came to steal her baby away. And she was notorious in Stonemarket for believing in fairies right until she was in her 90s. And that's the story of Sarah and the Feskies and the little tiny baby who almost got stolen. Thank you very much. That's a silly story. So now we can hear the bells as if we are in London. Ringing out, they are. Ringing to tell us that it's just after 6 in the evening on a Friday night. We're in a tiny village here. Oh, and I saw a hedgehog this week. This big prickly hedgehog outside my front door. And it was very exciting because we love hedgehogs around here. So this is a story from London town. Well, it's a traditional story, a Jewish story. And people say it came to London through all the Jewish people who came into the East End. And it's about a blue blanket. There was an old man who was waiting for the birth of his first grandchild. He was a tailor, a man who sewed. And so he wanted to make something for his little baby grandchild. Now, I didn't know whether it was a boy or a girl yet. So, because in those days you didn't go and have pictures of your tummy before your baby was born. So nobody knew. So he thought, I can't make it an outfit until I know who it is. So I'll make it a blanket. And as he was very good at the art of sewing, he sewed all his love into that blanket as he made it. It wasn't just a plain blue blanket. Oh, it had special marks in it. It had letters. And so there was that beautiful blanket ready to wrap up the baby. And as soon as that baby was born, it was wrapped in the blanket. And as the baby grew up, the baby loved that blanket. I don't know if you ever had family members who loved blankets, who took their blanket everywhere with them as they were a tiny child. Well, that's what this little child did. Little boy called Tom. And he took that blanket everywhere. He would drag it behind him as he started to walk. So what happened to the blanket? It got a bit dirty. And it got a bit torn around the edges. And it got to the state where the mother looked at it and went, oh, this blanket is not fit anymore. It'll have to be changed. So they took the blanket back to the grandfather, and he looked at the blanket and he said, now, my young grandson, you are big enough to have something else from this blanket. I think I could make you a coat, a nice warm coat for the winter. So that's what happened. He cut and he sewed and he cut and he sewed and he cut and he sewed, and he made a fine blue coat for young Tom to wear. And of course, young Tom wore it everywhere. He wore it to walk in the park. He wore it to splash in the puddles. He wore it to climb the trees. He wore it to the zoo when he saw the animals. He wore it everywhere. And guess what? After a while, it became a little bit grubby. And when you climb trees, sometimes it gets caught in the tree, and so it became a little bit torn. And after a while, Tom's mother said, that coat is not fit to be worn. It is a disgrace. So they went back to the grandfather and said, can you do something with this coat? We love it. It is our favourite thing. But look at it. It's torn, it's tattered, it's dirty. Don't worry, said the grandfather. I have an idea. And he cut and he sewed and he cut and he sewed and he cut and he sewed. And he made a most beautiful, beautiful waistcoat. It was very smart. Oh, yes. And there, little Tom had a waistcoat now. It had been his blanket, it had been his coat, and now it was his waistcoat, and wow, was it good. But Tom, like many boys and girls in the world, when he wore his smartest clothes and his smartest waistcoat, he used to forget that he was wearing his smartest clothes and his waistcoat, and he would climb trees and jump in puddles. He would chase ducks, which you shouldn't do, but, you know, it happens, doesn't it? He would pretend he could fly. Woo! and he would pretend he could swim when he couldn't. But he never quite got under the water, because even Tom knew wearing your waistcoat under the water was a very bad idea and your mother would get very grumpy. But still, the waistcoat got a bit worn and tattered and torn a bit round the edges. And so it went back to the grandfather. Look at the waistcoat. It is very beautiful, but I don't know what to do with it anymore. What are we going to do with it? Don't worry, said his grandfather. I have a brilliant idea. I can't make a proper hat. You see, like John's wearing his very proper hat. I can't make one like that, but I could make one a bit like Baba C's hat. More. Oh, Baba C's got a very smart hat. Yes. Yeah, no, he couldn't make that, but he could make the smaller one underneath. That's it. He made a sort of big cap with the blue fabric of the blanket, of the coat, of the waistcoat. And wow, was it smart. And did it keep him warm in the winter? So Tom now wore his hat every day that he could. He wore it because now he was learning to play football on the streets of the East End. And he would kick the ball and run after his friends and scrub his knees against the ground as he fell over and throw his cap down when he was angry and then pick it up and scrape it back onto his head. So after a while, the cap got a bit dirty. It got a bit grubby. It got a bit worn round the edges. And back they went to grandfather, who was now getting a bit old. And he looked at the cap and he said, oh dear, I can save something from this. I can make you a bow tie. Have you ever worn a bow tie? Oh yes, a bow tie at your neck. Very smart indeed. Everybody needs a bow tie. So a bow tie was made. And on high days, on holidays, Tom would wear his bow tie. He was now bigger. He was almost a teenager now. But still, he loved that blue fabric. The blue fabric that reminded him of being a child, reminded him of his grandfather. It was beautiful. And so there was that little blue bow tie. But Tom, being Tom, he never stopped doing what he wanted to do. He never stopped climbing trees, pretending to fly, kicking footballs, walking in the park, jumping in puddles, even as a teenager. And so his blue bow tie got worn and torn and tattered and dirty round the edges. And they took it back to grandfather and said, what can we do with this? It's getting a bit small. And grandfather says, I have a great idea. There's just enough really good fabric to make a nice big blue button. And we can sew it on your new coat. So you bring your old coat with your new coat. Tom thought that was a great idea. And also, now he was a teenager, he didn't want his friends to know that this piece of blue fabric was so important to him. So the button was covered and the button was made, and it was sewn so beautifully onto his coat. And it matched the other buttons so wonderfully, even though it was the blue colour, that only Tom and his mother and his grandfather knew where the fabric had come from. And Tom grew up, and he didn't treat that coat any more carefully than anything else. He was now big, and the thing about a coat was it had to come off all the time and be thrown on the ground because you had other things to do. And if you were playing football, you needed the goalposts. If you were climbing a tree, you had to take it off before you climbed the tree. Oh, then you forgot. Oh dear, it's a bit muddy. And one day, when he got home, he looked at his coat, and the blue button had gone. And Tom said to his mother, what am I going to do? I haven't got my blue material anymore. And they went to the grandfather and said, what am I going to do? I haven't got my blue material anymore. But the grandfather looked at him and said, do you remember your first blanket? And Tom thought really hard and he said, yes, I can remember holding it. Do you remember your blue coat? And Tom thought, yes, I can remember wearing it. I do remember climbing the tiny tree in the park. Do you remember your waistcoat? Oh, yes, said Tom. I remember that birthday party when I spilled ice cream down it. Do you remember your bow tie? Oh, yes, he said. I remember wearing that and kicking a brilliant goal, even though I shouldn't have been out. And do you remember the tiny button? Oh, yes, I remember it as if it was yesterday, which it possibly was, when I threw it down and I scored a goal. Then, said your grandfather, you still have that button, that bow tie, that hat, that waistcoat, that coat, and that blanket. And now you have the story that tells of that blue fabric. And that story is going to last longer than you, and it will certainly last longer than me, said the grandfather. And we will tell the story and remember the blue fabric. And here am I telling the story, remembering the love of a grandfather for a grandchild. And let's pass that on again and again and again. Thank you. Woo! Now, the bells have stopped. They must be on half time tonight. They did do something yesterday morning, so they must have had an event. Anyway, so let us walk down into the East End of London, into the area around Aldgate. I don't know. There must have been a gate there, and I don't know which gate it was. Big gates, because you couldn't come into the city unless you went through the gates, and the gates would be closed because it was supposed to protect everybody inside the gates. And those locked outside, well, they were the outsiders. And actually, a whole city grew up outside the gates of London. There you go. So I must go and find out which gates are what. And this is a story about a man and his daughter. And the man was a blind beggar. There was once a knight. This is a long time ago, in the 13th century. He was a proper knight. He had armour, you know, breastplate, those crunky leg things made of metal, arms made of metal. It was a bit like a robot, really. It's an early robot armour. But instead of having mechanicals inside, you had a person doing all the wonder. You must have walked around exactly like a robot if you wore armour. Anyway, this was a knight who fought battles, who was the son of Simon de Montfort, a kingmaker, a very important person in England in the 14th century. Except sometimes we forget to tell the stories of those who don't win and cheer and survive well at the end of the battle. Because this knight had an accident. He fell off his horse. Tumble, 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 crash. And sometimes when you have a big fall, it affects your sight. And this knight went blind. And a blind knight is no good to man or beast. So from being a rich and wealthy man, he became an ill man who could not see. But he was nursed by a beautiful woman who loved him and cared for him and said she would stay for him even though he was now blind, which is very nice, isn't it? Not everybody would do that. So our knight, with no sight, had a lovely wife, and they had a beautiful little baby, and they called the baby Bessie. And Bessie was a chirruping, happy, singing little girl. But her dad had no job, no money. And they now lived in the run-down areas of London, the areas that were difficult. And her dad became a beggar. He was known as the blind beggar. He walked with his dog and a bell, ringing the bell. And because there was only one way to live if you were blind and a beggar, he begged for money. Every day you could see the blind beggar and everybody knew him. But the beggar and his wife were very careful about their beautiful little daughter. They protected her. They didn't want her out in the world. They were very careful. And she grew up to be a very beautiful young lady. But she was also a strong young lady, and she had her own wills and intentions. And she saw how poor they were and how they lived. And she said, I need to go out and earn my keep. But her parents didn't want that. No, they didn't want that at all. But she would have it. She insisted. And at the end, they could do no more. So she went to a big inn, a pub, a hotel. And she asked to work there. And soon she was known as a very hard-working young woman. But she was also very beautiful and attracted the attentions of many people. First, there was the innkeeper's son, who looked at Bessie with those eyes and followed her round. And then there was a young knight who came to stay at the inn while his horse was recovering from an injury. And he watched and saw how Bessie was really good with people, was very polite, very nice, and very careful. Then there was a rich merchant who came with his silks and satins to sell to the Londoners. And he stayed at the big inn, as if it was the most famous hotel in London, which it probably was at the time. And there he was with his silks and satins, and he took a shine to young Bessie. We have 3 young men, and then there was a fourth gentleman of leisure wandered into the inn to stay. And his eyes were caught by young Bessie. And now she had 4 of them wandering around. Oh, me. Well, things soon came to a head. And first it was the merchant. One day, as Bessie was working hard, the merchant came up to her with a long piece of beautiful velvet cloth, perhaps of this red colour, and said, Bessie, if you would marry me, I would make sure you were dressed in the finest velvets every day of your life. Marry me and you will have all the riches a London merchant can give you. And Bessie looked at him, and she wasn't rude, because she could have just said, oh, no, thank you. She was very polite, and she said, kind sir, that is very nice of you, but I'm afraid not. I can't. And then it was the turn of the gentleman of leisure. Him who put so much gold out, ate so well, ate in the private rooms, didn't eat with the others. And he came forth with his money and said, Bessie, if you married me, you would have a life of wealth and leisure. Marry me and all your dreams will come true. And Bessie looked at him and said, Thank you, kind sir. But no, I really can't. Now, of course, the innkeeper had heard all this, and he said something to his son, and his son, oh my goodness, he thought they were all proposing. I better propose now. And he rushed upstairs and he almost grabbed hold of Bessie, which would have been very naughty, but he just grabbed her arm and said, Bessie, Bessie, I love you. Will you marry me? You could have this inn and you would be kept in the way you deserve to be kept, as a wealthy innkeeper's wife. Poor Bessie, this was number 3, and she was beginning to get a bit tired of it all. And she said, oh, sir, that is so kind of you, but I think not. And then, as she went downstairs, feeling a bit tired, going down to get some lunch, woe betide her, but did not the knight come forward? And he knelt so elegantly on one knee and said, oh, Bessie, I am a knight and I love you deeply. Please marry me. And poor Bessie, she'd had about enough of it. Number 4. But she held herself together and she smiled politely and said, I am terribly sorry, sir, but no, and rushed into the kitchen. Oh, what was she going to do? 4 of them desperate to marry her. 4 of them, each offering as much as they could. And she didn't know quite what to do and what was best to do. So she spent a long while walking up and down, thinking hard, what should she do? And then she had the best answer ever. So she brought all the young men together and she said, I am so honoured that you all would want to marry me, a lowly girl working in an inn. And I will say to you, if you want to marry me, you need to go and ask my father. Oh, yes, they all said, who is your father? And that's when the bombshell hit. My father is the blind beggar of Aldgate. You will find him walking the streets with his dog and his bell, for he is blind and he begs for a living. Oh!
You muted yourself, darling.
I don't know how that happened. When did I do that?
That's on me.
Don't know.
I was muting somebody else.
Oh!
And I accidentally muted you. I beg your pardon.
That's all right. I'm sure Bessie would have liked to have been muted when the merchant came and said, I cannot go and ask your dirty father for your hand in marriage because he's only a beggar. So that was probably quite a good thing.
It would have been mutual.
Yes. So that was one down. Then the gentleman of leisure looked at Bessie and suddenly his whole appearance changed. He looked at Bessie and he did see a pretty girl, but a pretty girl whose father was a beggar. Oh, suddenly she looked like she was a beggar too. And he turned away and said, oh, no, no, not for me, and marched out. Then there was the innkeeper's son, and he looked at her and went, you are the beggar's daughter, that dirty, scrappy beggar I see every day. And that was it. But the knight who had stayed there, who had stayed to look after his horse, who was kindness himself, he looked at Bessie and he thought, she isn't whoever she is. Her father is whoever he is. All I know is that Bessie is kind. Bessie is good. And she is a beautiful, kind, lovely young lady. And he said to her, take me to your father and I will ask for your hand in marriage. She was a bit surprised. He thought he was a bit brave going to her father. And actually, she didn't know what her father would say. Okay, she said. Well, she only had one half day off a week. That was a Wednesday afternoon. So come Wednesday afternoon, she collected the knight and she marched him onto the street, and she didn't sugar the pill. She marched down Aldgate until they could hear the ringing, jinging bell. And the blind beggar was there with his little dog walking along the street. Father, father, she said, it is your daughter Bessie, and I have brought somebody who needs to talk to you. I will leave you both to talk. And she ran away quickly because she didn't want to hear what they were going to say. It's terribly embarrassing, somebody saying you're very beautiful. Awful. So she ran away back to the inn for a bit of peace and quiet to do some sewing. Anyway, that evening, back came the knight full of smiles. He said, a date has been set. You will be mine on the next quarter day, which is a funny thing to say. Quarter days come, well, a quarter of the way through the year. And they used to be very important because you would pay money on those days for rent and things like that. And your father says he's going to organise the wedding. So I will be ready whenever the date is set and the place is set. Well, of course, everybody chatted, didn't they? His daughter's going to get married. Give her away. How is there going to be a feast? What are we going to do? Has anybody been invited? And lots and lots and lots of people had actually been invited. How are they going to pay for it? He's a beggar. Well, they did have a big wedding in a proper church, and afterwards they had a fine feast. And that evening, everybody looked around. For you see, they had forgotten that the blind beggar had a past, that the blind beggar was a member of an old and traditional family. And he still had some money, although he couldn't work. And on that evening, at the height of the celebrations, when everybody was stood up to toast the happy couple, the blind beggar and his dog with his bell stood up. But tonight he looked very fine. His begging suit had gone and he was in dark black velvet. And the dog was still there, but the dog seemed to be brushed clean and tidy. Sometimes even dogs have to have baths, even though my dog hates it. All dogs have their bath day. And even the dog looked smart. And the blind beggar rang his bell out loud in the middle of all these people. And he said, I may be a beggar, but I was once a knight. And a knight is honourable until the end. And this young man, he came and he asked for my daughter's hand. And I know that she was rejected by others because they looked down on me. So I respect this man. And I'm going to give him a little something to start his married life with my daughter, because he chose my daughter not for wealth, but for who she was. And there was a bag of gold passed to the young knight and his new wife, which is always useful when you set up together. And it was a lovely ending to a beautiful day. And you know, that is a long, long time ago, that story. But if you go around London now, you've got to find the statue of the blind beggar and the dog, because it's there. Because people remember that tale centuries and centuries later. And respect for a young woman. That's good. And that's my story of Bessie and the blind beggar.
That was amazing. And it would appear that Aldgate was the Eastern Gate during Roman times, and the road direct to Colchester. So it's very important, and that's Aldgate High Street was incredibly important. And there's 4 etymological, whatever the origin of word stuff is, explanations, but the likelihood is that it means Old Gate.
Yeah.
But it could mean Alegate because of the. I mean, but that was the craze hangout, blind beggar.
Yes, I didn't think it was suitable for this evening.
Absolutely not. But there's a couple of other explanations. But the likelihood it's that even in medieval times it was considered incredibly old because of its Roman connection and the Colchester Road.
Well, that's great, because you see, go north on the Colchester Road, past Colchester, onto
Stowmarket, Ipswich.
That's it, Stowmarket, where the Feskies are. So they all link those stories, you see.
Absolutely down there, yes.
Yes. So, you know, that's I try and get these loose links in, you know.
Well, it's a lovely little road trip.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I did Walthamstow to Stowmarket last Friday. Not again. Friday night on a bank holiday, a national holiday. Not good.
Oh, what, you drove?
We drove, yeah, because I have an ambulance which is half converted. It's still yellow ambulance colour, and I drove in my yellow ambulance from Walthamstow, where I'd been working all day, up to Stowmarket for the East Anglian Storytelling Festival last Friday, and it took longer than you can possibly think.
I know that road well. I've travelled that road a lot. Anyway, Louis, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Right. I'm sorry, I just assumed that was 3 and it was 43. That was your last story, but
that's all right. That's absolutely fine. That'll work. Yeah.
Have I cut you off?
No, that's absolutely fine. And I like that. I like knowing bits further because I'll add them more to the story. It's lovely.
Yeah, so
an East End storytelling thing to do soon. So.
And I have a question I ask anyone looking into East End stories. Have you come across a tramp storyteller from about, could have been any way from the 30s, 40s, that sort of time, called Cheesecake Charlie?
Not yet.
I've only, a Coleman told me, I was doing a thing in Brentwood, and he told me that a storyteller used to come round and sit on the pavement, and children would give him a halfpenny, and he would tell a story. And his name was Cheesecake Charlie, and it was just one of those conversational things that while I was working in Brentwood, and which you would have passed through on the way from Walthamstow or bypass, and I've asked everyone who's done anything to do with London stories whether they've come across this cat, and I can't find anything about him at all.
No, I shall ask. There was a photographer, Stan, and I can't remember his second name, and he's being celebrated. He was just a man who lived in a house, and he lived in the same house all his life. And he took photographs, and he took photographs of his family and the street and the celebrations for the coronation and the celebrations for the Jubilee. And the family actually decorated the house in the same way this year for the Platinum Jubilee.
Oh, he might know. Well,
he does. He's no longer alive, but his family will be there, and I will ask them. But,
fantastic.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem is the community have changed, and a lot of that community who would have been there have moved out, and they're along the way from me here, because I've met people in Cruise Hill, Waltham Cross, out that way, who used to live in the East End, and they moved out. That's
why there's the Pearly Kings of Oxford, because they're the same families. They're Pearly King families, but that's another thing.
Yeah.
Pearly Kings will make no sense whatsoever to Kamal, and probably less to Battersea, we will explain them to you when we meet in Morocco. We will explain pearly kings. But meanwhile, we will go next Friday. We go to Greece.
Oh no, Greece now.
Yes, we go to Despina
Yes.
because she's about to start
Yeah.
classes after that, so she can only do next Friday. So Babasi has been the ultimate gentleman and moved aside. So it's really good to see David. Hello, David.
Hello.
And Louis, it's great to have you back.
How do I expect what that means?
He's been to see the meerkats.
Oh,
And
yes.
baby meerkat. I love meerkats.
And it's good to see Kamal.
Yeah. I went to see the meerkats and the snakes.
The snakes.
Oh, he had a snake round his
Yeah.
neck.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's great to see Baba and Waleed, who showed himself for 2 seconds in front of that magnificent picture of Marrakesh. And anyone else who's out there.
Kamal.
I've mentioned Kamal.
Oh.
I
guess I was besides myself. I didn't hear it.
I wouldn't forget Kamal because or else who's gonna serve me when I go out there in November? He'll lock me out of the cafe if I'm not polite to Kamal. And so anyway, but it's been great. It's been lovely. Another round of applause for Sarah Lloyd Winder.
Superb, Sarah, as always.
Put on the ring my
Swap hats.
top hats. And
Do they have bottom hats? But bum.
I don't know about that. Not that sort of bottom, but
John, did you mention next Tuesday?
And I'm getting there. So Tuesday, of course, we have our young international tellers, Yasname from Punjab, the sisters from Nigeria, and anyone else that can make it. Would be fantastic. Love to see you all. Love to see you back there as adults supporting our young tellers. Meanwhile, bye everyone.
bye, Susan.
To be continued until the next time.
Bye.
Superlative, Sarah. See you next time, Louis.
See you next summer.